So, Dick, I just wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about how you got to this story, because I read the book that, this was a knock on the door, basically. And I wonder if that happens to you very much, where you've got people coming to you with pitching you ideas in that way.
Yeah, good question, because I got lucky on this one in the sense that and I'll talk about it more in a second, a knock on the door led to White Hot Hate. And yeah, I actually get pitched stories a fair amount. You know, just whether it's an email from someone, I have a book for you, my cousin was in the mafia or something like that. And probably 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. They have never led to anything I really wanted to spend several years on to produce a book. This time was different, though, because the knocker, the person who knocked on my door, was a friend and neighbor across the street who knows me pretty well and knows the kinds of stories that I like to work on and I find meaningful and I think are important. And he happened to have in his living room, passing through the Boston area on their way back to Kansas, a friend of his who was in the company of a man by the name of Dan Day, who's a central character in White Hot Hate as the FBI informant, along with one of the Somali refugee and immigrants who played a major role in the Somali community, a man by the name of Mursal Nalaye. And so my neighbor and friend knocked on the door and said, I have some people that you might be interested in talking to. And I just went over there and spent several hours talking to them and realizing, oh my gosh, there's an important story here, a fascinating story. I only had a passing memory of the 2016 news cycle surrounding this event and this bomb plot and the arrests and all that. But to be in the same room with the FBI informant and then quickly Googling and, catching up a little bit on the news of it all when it happened and the news since, I realized, wow, this story is just begging to be told. And aren't I lucky to have this opportunity?
Well, it's like instead of somebody asking for a cup of sugar, definitely you got what the intrepid journalist and a writer gets, and that's an invitation. It's not every day you get an invitation to meet an FBI informant, I have to
No,
say.
no, like I say, finally I got lucky in the sense that, several times a year someone comes at me and it's just it's just not a book. It's not something I want to do. Maybe someone else would, but I don't want to do. But this was like, whoa, I finally hit the lottery,
Yeah, definitely. This was a story that I did not know. And so I was really glad that you took it on, because you certainly have a capacity and a deep understanding for explaining how kind of the criminal underworld works, and then also how in criminal investigations and the FBI,
Hmm.
how they work too.
Yeah.
And I think I told you this already, but I really have to bring it up again. And I've talked to people a lot about it. I didn't know that the FBI did presentations to the public.
Yeah.
And because I've kind of think of, death by PowerPoint. And I have this image of the FBI one way, but clearly in the book, the folks in Garden City knew the FBI was there, and they did a presentation for the Lions Club. So you really dispelled some of probably the stereotypes or mythology for me around how the FBI works. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how did the FBI operate in this part of the United States, or maybe you want to generalize further. But I have to say, if I knew I was going to go to, a presentation by the FBI, that I'd be nervous. Not, and so tell us more, please.
Yeah. Well, I think, out in Southwest Kansas, where this story happens, there were two FBI agents out of the Garden City office, and they were in charge of a region. so it's obviously very unlike, the major metropolitan areas that have huge FBI office and whatnot. These are just regional offices. Both agents were homegrown and in law enforcement. I mean, from the area, and then in law enforcement, they ended up as a Fed, as an FBI agent. I'm not sure, how common it is for the Lions clubs to host the local FBI agents around the country. But in a community like Garden City, these two agents are of the community. They're, in a sense, from the community. They respond to a request like that as outreach, and it's sort of educational and explanatory. They don't give anything away. It's more like letting them know that there is a federal presence here. We are them, and it's only us. They don't even have any administrative support in their office. It's just the two of them. And just talk about the kinds of crimes that are issues that are federal issues that they're watching out for. Drug running, gun running, again, that federal crime. And actually, I'm not sure they also play it close to the vest. I'm not sure when that, because I did some research on that Lions Club visit, that they got into terrorism, and especially domestic terrorism, but which in 2016 was still not really on anyone's front burner the way it is today.
It is interesting how issues of domestic terrorism kind of ebb and flow in sort of public awareness. Of course, I used to live in Oklahoma, and it was
Sure.
after the Oklahoma City bombing. And so that was, a site that was really present in the everyday lives and memories of people. I wonder what you think of that ebb and flow, and why is it that there's not a better understanding of domestic terrorist threats or the presence of domestic terrorists in this country?
That's a good question. And I guess one thought I have is the fact that, um, Timothy McVeigh and that incident, and even though it's in our lifetime, it actually feels a long time ago now. And there was Ruby Ridge, but in that era, domestic terror was a real concern, public safety issue. It was in the news. It was a big deal. But 9/11 changed everything in obviously in so many ways, but certainly when it comes to the public safety issue of terrorism, because suddenly everything became, about Al Qaeda and then later ISIS, and it was the foreign terrorists, not the radical extreme right like a Timothy McVeigh, there was Ruby Ridge and whatnot. That got overwhelmed by everything 9/11. Homeland Security was created in the wake of 9/11. Massive emphasis on that kind of foreign terrorism and the possibility of that. And I'm not sure, if the other went away or it may well have quieted extremely in the context. But it certainly did. And then it started to rear its ugly head again over the course of the Obama presidency, the nation's first Black president. That started to stir things again under the radar in this sort of in that world, and got some traction well before, I think, our national security apparatus really recognized its potential and its potency. That's, again, we're fully aware of, especially after last January.
Yes.
But agents in the field, and again, this story unfolds in 2016 during the course of that presidential election. Agents in the field, were becoming increasingly aware of the threat of domestic terrorism, and perhaps and this happens, law enforcement gets so used to targeting one thing, and again, in the wake of 9/11, importantly and necessarily was focusing on Al Qaeda and that kind of terrorist threat, that it's hard to turn the Queen Mary into another direction. They've been, and it's happened in other contexts, like for the longest time, the FBI was obsessed with the mafia and breaking up the mafia. And it was hard for them to shift after the mafia was pretty much shattered from its heyday and whatnot, to shift gears into other types of criminal and racketeering enterprises. So, and that goes to some kind of institutional dynamic, but I think that was in play here in a little bit of a slowness to shift about, wait, we have a more pressing threat now than we do, say, the threat of 9/11.
Well, something I also realized after thinking about your other books, Black Mass and your book on Whitey Bulger as well, focusing solely on him, and so all informants, FBI informants, are not created equal.
That's for sure. And I think
So I also was really worried about your main character during this book, and I thought that anybody who was going to be an informant would have some training, have that there was I don't know, some process. Now he knows his way around a gun, that's for sure. But can you tell us a little bit about FBI informants and maybe what you've learned about them?
Well, yeah, and again, Dan Day, the informant in this story, and a Kansan, homegrown in Garden City itself. He kind of a little bit breaks the mold of at least the informant that I'm used to, knowing about or reporting about or writing about, in the sense that he was an ordinary guy. He was not typically, at least in these other contexts of FBI and informants and stuff, the informant is a player in the underworld, is a player, is a criminal himself. And for a variety of possible reasons, the FBI is able to turn him. It's a dangerous dance and a complicated one, because both sides are trying to game the other side. And the law, the criminal informant has to be monitored to make sure, the information is good and whatnot, but also that he's not exploiting his relationship with the FBI in order to get away with his crimes and perhaps to eliminate his rivals and whatnot. There's none of that in the dynamic with Dan Day at all. And while Dan, I think, is a pretty shrewd guy in terms of how ability to read people and size people up, these criminal informants that I'm referring to, they are street savvy, streetwise.
Scary. They're kind of scary.
Yeah, in ways that Dan, would have never experienced. So it's kind of a completely different world in terms of the work and the role that Dan Day played in this, really important investigation to stop terrorist bombing against, Muslims.
One of the things I am really interested in is, having lived on the Great Plains. I used to live in the panhandle of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
It was a culture shock for me because I grew up in North Carolina, and when I moved out there, wow, this is totally different. I'd never heard of the John Birch Society until I moved to the panhandle of Texas. I had no idea. I've been to Emporia, Kansas, which you mentioned in your book. I didn't realize the meat packing plants and, all these things that are out there on the Great Plains. It's possible to live in the United States and not really know your own country. Bubbles exist, and they've existed. And I certainly became aware of that. And I wonder if you would be willing to kind of describe this setting, Kansas, Garden City, this area of the United States, because I imagine, I think you said before, you really had never been there except for maybe driving through, like a lot of us have.
Yeah, and I actually was hitchhiking right after college with a friend and roommate that we hitchhiked around the country, and couldn't get through Kansas fast enough at that time. After leaving Denver, we were trying to get to the South, Frank. I kept going out to Kansas for a 6 to 8 months period, to be on the ground and do the research for this story until COVID hit. And yeah, this corner of Southwest Kansas. It's the Great Plains, so it's incredibly flat. You can see forever. It reminded me almost like looking over across the plains where the sun would set, and in the seemingly infinite distance that you kind of couldn't see. You could just see where the sky came down and the land was. It reminded me of looking out over the ocean in terms of a sunset and that flat ocean, and then the sun coming down. It was just so flat, and there was something beautiful and remarkable about all that. And I was trying, again, because so like myself, I sometimes think fresh eyes are a real benefit, coming into and researching and going deep, and then hopefully trying to evoke that sense of place then in the writing. And then in particular, Garden City stands out as being fairly unique for that greater region because it has become a magnet for immigrants, over the past several decades, and has become what one professor at the University of Kansas has called a multicultural mecca, which is, you tell people that anywhere, like, there are more languages spoken, for example, in Garden City High School than there are in my high school outside of Boston or some greater city. And people go, "What are you talking about? You're talking about Kansas," and it's true because, and the reason for that is the work that those meatpacking plants that you mentioned, Patricia, these sprawling meatpacking plants in the region, and have attracted, initially decades ago in the 50s and 60s when those meatpacking plants were built, Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. And so now we're well into generations of Mexican Americans in that region. But in the 70s, it was Vietnamese. There's a significant Vietnamese population in Garden City as they fled Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. And since around the turn of the century, increasingly there are refugees from Africa, Muslims, and they come to America, and whether it could be Maine or it could be Minnesota, which are very big, large populations of Somali and Muslims in particular. Word gets out. All it takes is a few to end up in Garden City, and then suddenly the word gets out. There's work here. And that's what happened over the course of a year, where there's now a significant Somali population in Garden City. I think, from what I could tell, and again, I can't claim to be an expert, but there is this welcoming and quiet accommodation, as again, this professor from Kansas called it, to all the newcomers, and appreciation for the work and the jobs they fill. And certainly the social services and the schools have responded, and by providing programs for, speaking, English as a second language and other cultural transitional things. So, I think you have a progressive police chief, you have a city manager who's aware of all this stuff now. I mean, it's part of the fabric of the community. And in that sense, it's a very different place as far as the Great Plains is concerned.
I think it's great. A book like yours says that your own country can surprise you.
Yes.
That there are places in this country, in the United States, that you think but you really don't know. And I love that about your book. I think it's a really important contribution on so many levels. And that's one of them, that it just explains that multicultural communities exist in all sorts of places around the United States, and in rural communities too, and on the Great Plains. When we're looking at this, the development of this terrorist plot, this domestic terrorist plot, central to it is something that probably more the public is aware of now, and that's the role of social media in making it possible for people to find each other and coalesce around their own intolerance. And I wonder if you would mind talking about that a little bit, and the role that social media played, like Facebook in particular.
And you're right to notice that it plays a big role. And in my mind, I almost consider that a character in the story, and a theme. because this is how, again, the core, the plotters, the bomb plotters, there were four of them. One of obviously turned out to be Dan Day, an informant. But they all found each other through social media, and militia movements that had a presence on social media, and then had private chat rooms, and then had other, I'm talking about Facebook, largely Facebook, in postings and liking each other and liking what they were saying. And then they had WhatsApp, another device to communicate. And it was a way for them initially to find each other and join one militia in particular, called the Three Percenters, and then move to something called the Kansas Security Force. And then increasingly through their interactions, some of it now in person, but still largely on social media, they recognized that they wanted to do more than what was even being discussed, in terms of the views and issues and perspectives on those through those militias. And they created their own offshoot of the Kansas Security Force, and they called themselves the Crusaders, which was to crusade against the Muslims who were living in the Garden City itself and in the Garden City area, feeling that it was their patriotic duty to exterminate them. But all that evolved a lot, initially, and then was sustained by Facebook, by WhatsApp, and social media. So in that sense, I feel like it was, played a significant role and was like a character. Once they're underway, they would have almost nightly meetings on WhatsApp where they would all, log in and however that you do it, and carry on, and have a meeting and trade their, rants and racist ideology, and obviously realized that they were not alone in their views, but part of this community that made them all feel like they were somebody.
And this plan to bomb the apartment complex, oh, that was a cat dispute nearby me. Sorry about that. So the plan to do this series of attacks, it's really incremental, and they build on each other's, which it's the title of your book, White Hot Hate. So how does this nascent sort of, anti-immigrant sentiment is not new to the United States.
Right.
We've seen it really for centuries in all sorts of iterations. So this is, to my mind, a kind of a historical element of the US experience. But how did it move from this sort of nascent kind of hateful flyer in the library, social media connections to, no, we're really going to do this?
Right. There was a trigger. There was a triggering event, because in the winter and spring, early spring of 2016, you had the emergence of this very small group, the Crusaders. You had men by the name of Patrick Stein, Curtis Allen, and Gavin Wright, and Dan Day, who were part of a larger group. Who were meeting and talking nightly about matters of the day, which was, Islamic phobic, federal government off our backs, all kinds of extreme right-wing white nationalist type of views and rhetoric, and lots of just, and Dan Day started recording them for the FBI as their informant, and the stuff is just, venomous, right? But it's hate speech, it's hateful speech. And then in June of 2016, and I think many of your listeners and viewers will probably remember this, there was the Pulse nightclub massacre in Florida, where a gunman, a terrorist, announcing he was inspired by ISIS-inspired event, walked into the Pulse nightclub around closing time and just annihilated a whole bunch of people. It was the worst casualty numbers since 9/11, frankly, I think. And that was, obviously a horrifying event. massive and big news, committed by, an ISIS terrorist, an ISIS-inspired terrorist. And the very next day, Patrick Stein, it was like something, and he talked about it, a switch was flipped, that the time was now, something had to be done about these Muslims, who he viewed every Muslim as an ISIS terrorist. And in their community, they had a significant Muslim Somali population, and he saw them as a clear and present danger. So after the Pulse nightclub, he announced, we got to take action. We can no longer just be talking about this. I think the phrase he used is, I don't want to be some kind of what he called a keyboard patriot. And Curtis Allen and Gavin Wright were all in right away. Dan Day, obviously, given his role, had to pretend he was all in, because that first phase, as you say, this built over the next several months. The first was to say, we have to do something. We're going to go after them. We need to eliminate and exterminate them. How we're going to do that, that's what we got to figure out, the plan. And there was, but that was a pivotal moment. And from that June moment on, this was a conspiracy to build weapons of mass destruction, which they were ultimately charged with. And it almost unfolded in, when you step back and look at it and get your arms around, the tapes and the events and the progress they made, you can see it in almost acts, the act one being that sort of exploring, well, who's in besides us and any of the other people who have been on these nightly WhatsApp chats, complaining about everything. Let's see if anyone else wants to join us. So there's that phase. And even there was discussion amongst the three men, like Patrick wanted to have a few more patriots with them in terms of this mission, whereas someone like Curtis Allen said, we don't need anybody else. The four of us can take it. And in fact, the more people you have, the more security risks you have in terms of word leaking and getting out that what we're up to. So there was a little bit of debate about whether to even be doing that, but that they went on a bit of a recruiting period in which they presented to some of the people they felt they could trust. And that became an opportunity in the book, again, because what made this book happen was being able to get all the tapes, and get way past headlines of terrorist stories that we've read about, but to really, really reconstruct and dramatize how something like this comes about. And so they had these, fascinating meetings with their friends, hinting and presenting about how they wanted to do something now. And it becomes a debate about what a militia is, which I thought was fascinating because, the other people said, whoa, like I'm a prepper and I'm stockpiling food and guns and ammunition. If those Muslims come to my property and they come after me, I'm ready. But you're talking about going after them and being proactive and, killing people. I don't do that. That's not what a militia is for. So whether you're an offensive or a defensive entity became, a debatable scene in someone's trailer in Southwest Kansas.
I never thought I would encounter it. I was kind of laughing because I thought there's almost this epistemology, like, who are we? Who are we? Yeah. What is a militia? What is it? Are that debate about like keyboard activist versus, are you willing to do something? And Curtis was the person that you really did such a wonderful job with in this book of highlighting for me. I was nervous all the time. The whole book made me nervous because I thought, well, the tension is like, I don't know if I know what happens, but I can't believe what a nail biter it was. And so Curtis was a little, I don't want to give too much away, but he's savvy. I mean, we're not just talking about stereotypes here. And that's what I love about this book, is that every person defies stereotypes.
Yeah. Curtis was the one who was ex-military, and maybe that accounts for some of his skepticism, and it gets, he was the one who at different times was suspicious a little bit about Dan Day. Couldn't put his finger on it, but didn't quite trust Dan Day. And Dan, that became, and I don't want to give too much away either, but that became really scary for Dan at a couple of times, in terms of danger and his life being at risk as Curtis tested him, and tested. But fortunately for Dan, they became passing moments. But in real time, in the moment, it's hard to imagine being in Dan's shoes and not wonder whether he'd be able to go home that night, or get home that night, given Curtis's suspicion. Whereas Gavin, and especially Patrick Stein, had no doubts about, and didn't second guess whether Dan was all in and one of them, all for one and one for all. Dan succeeded in having his persona as being one of them and like-minded in every way. Those guys, were persuaded. It was Academy Award winning acting.
You're exactly right, because and for me, and I think for a lot of readers, we have ideas about who watches, who consumes what kind of news, who has what kinds of political positions, or was a supporter of this candidate versus that candidate. And one of the context for this entire book is the presidential campaign and the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. So you're also looking at a group of domestic terrorists who don't want to ruin Donald Trump's chances.
Right.
And so that they're strategic, they're concerned, but also even Dan, he's a devout Christian, he's a family man, he's worked in areas that broadly speaking would be law enforcement, but he's not what the kind of this huge red blue divide would suggest. Is that fair to say? To my mind, that was my reading.
No, I mean that's what I think makes Dan so interesting and makes it, we all categorize everybody in two neat and tidy ways, where I think Dan defies those stereotypes and categories, even though he's, like you already mentioned, he knows a ton about guns. He's a strong gun advocate, but also gun safety. He carries all the time, has carried for years, says he feels naked without his pocket carry, his concealed weapon. And his Christianity and his belief in the church and God having a purpose, which has helped guide him through this, dangerous, experience. Not as suspicious as his militia cohorts, but of the federal government, and overreach and those kinds of things. But yeah, he's one of the warmest, most humane people I've ever met at the same time. And, not some kind of, the way we can stereotype people, Christian in the sense that just let people live, and enjoys, it's not like, it doesn't mean he's, goes into the Somali community and, but he's through this experience has made some Somali friends, but doesn't mean he just, to each his own. They have every right to be here as I have a right to be here, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a worldliness or humanity and a generosity about him that you certainly don't find in someone like Patrick Stein.
And so I'm interested in, you had access to these tapes, and Dan made those at one time, passed out. That not awesome for a rookie informant to do, but hey, things happen. How did you get this kind of access? And then in broader terms, how do you gain the trust of people? I mean, even the FBI, did the FBI set limitations on you, or did you have a track record that allowed you a little more freedom to move and navigate the story?
Well, there's different kind of, source destination, so to speak. And as briefly as the FBI, yeah, I've written a lot about the FBI. If anything, I was worried about them just shutting me down because, most of the work I've done about the FBI has to do with the Boston gangster Whitey Bulger, who was involved in the worst informant scandal in FBI history. So all that reporting in the books about that are all about corrupt FBI agents. So I generally speaking, I don't think I'm the FBI, any friend of the FBI's. In this story, but I like to go where the story goes. And in this story, I think you had a couple of agents. I mean, this is how they should be teaching it. This is the playbook. This is how it's supposed to go. But even with that, they were still involved in a sense on the case because it was on appeal to the Federal Circuit Court. And I didn't have access to them until near the very end, which was, frustrating. So that as them as people, but I did have, because the trial was over, and the record was on appeal, I did have access to the trial record and to all those tapes. If I had gone any sooner, that stuff probably wouldn't have been public information yet or gettable because it was still ongoing. And I needed that. Anybody needs that to truly tell the story in a three-dimensional way. And I also saw that as a huge opportunity, because most of these terrorism cases, whether it's a domestic or a foreign terrorist, they don't go to trial. All right. So and I'm talking from a perspective as a journalist or a storyteller, an author. So what you get, a coverage you get about a lot of these cases is, and it's usually very good, but a news coverage, headlines and stories about an indictment and arrest in which there's some information. But they mostly get, there's mostly guilty pleas. They're pled out prior to trial. And it's at trials and through the exhibits where you go from what I'll call the surface of the story to be able to go way deep into the story. That's where you get the raw storytelling material. So I felt like this was a unique opportunity, again, to explore terrorism, domestic terrorism, and a terrorist plot in a way that's atypical from the kinds of plots, because it's not the only terrorist plot we've had, but the ones we've had in the last several years that end up getting pled out, and there's just no way to get too deep into the story.
How did you decide? I mean, by the time we're getting to the end, and I encourage anybody who's in our audience who's got a question, please post that in chat if you haven't done so already. We'll get to as many as we can for Dick about his latest book, White Hot Hate. How did you decide how you were going to organize this book? Because I have to say the trial part was amazing. And you just had a cast of characters, lawyers, the general public. I mean, it was all there. So how did you finally settle on how you were going to structure this book?
Yeah, because there's obviously, that's a choice, and there's other ways to go. It could have been built entirely around the trial as a trial, a procedural, as they call them. But I guess it was, once I had managed, and we didn't really get to talk about this, is sort of what I call the human sources, which in this story, the main one being Dan Day, was once after meeting him across the street, when I had that knock on the door, and following up at that, and knowing that because he had been the government's key witness, he had never really been able to talk beyond the witness stand. And if he was willing to open up and tell his story in full, to answer every question I might have, I just felt like I wanted to tell the story through, and I call him the accidental informant. Fell into this role without any training, being an ordinary guy. And both the stakes that were involved, the risks he took, the danger, and the public service that he provided. I just felt like he was the story, he was the through line. And from him, I can, reveal this horrible plot that was in the making. I can, examine FBI and tell the story of FBI, investigations and methodologies. I can explore white nationalism and the militia movement. I can explore Donald Trump's Islamophobic and anti-Muslim rhetoric during the course of his 2016 campaign. All this was intertwined, and I think that's what made this project or story so compelling and timely. So and then it just hopefully developing suspense, even though I think most readers know the outcome before they start, but it's in the storytelling. Is that Dan, when he started out, he had no idea where this was going to go, nor did the FBI. Initially, he was simply to be what they called their eyes and ears, and just keeping tabs on what's going on out there in terms of the militia movement and whatnot. And it could have ended there, except that he met Patrick Stein, Curtis Allen, and Gavin Wright, and went into the heart of darkness.
It really is like a heart of darkness, because you find yourself as a reader. I found myself as a reader thinking, I don't think he signed up for this.
Yeah.
And I think it's, for me, it was an education in you. Once a person steps into an informant role, there's only so they really cede control, and the effects. He had to kind of prepare his family. How is Dan, one of the people in our audience? I think I may have made people a little anxious. I didn't mean to. How's Dan? Is Dan all right?
Yes and no. Yeah, I mean, he's Dan, and he always just, it's, I don't know, this is his strength and his humility. He just, and it's growing up on the Great Plains, and, and the talk about the ebb and flow and the fall and rise of farming and all that. I mean, you learn to take what comes, or he seems to, and he just takes what comes. It was traumatizing what he went through, and I don't think he realized until it was over how exhausting and how beat up he was, in many ways. So there was recovery from that, and he, reached out and found someone to talk to about it. But there's also, I mean, he's got heart issue. I mean, he's got some real physical issues too, and I don't know if there's any connection to this experience, but that he has struggled with over the last couple years. So, but again, he's not melodramatic by any means, or he's looking for any favors or pity. He just, this is how it is. And he just does the best he can to take care of himself and also his family.
Do people know him in his community, or does he have any kind of protection? Have there been threats against him?
When the feds and the FBI arrested the other three in October of 2016, just weeks before the election, he got death. There was concern, and there was protection, and there were death threats. And then they go away. And then there was the trial in 2018 where he's a key witness, and then they come again, the threats. And then there's the sentencing in 2019. I mean, these kind of cases have a long thread to them, a long life in a way. So that kind of stirs it up. And he takes what he feels are some precautions in terms of defending him and his family, and they're described in the book. He's got a strategy, but other than that, he's living his life as best he can.
I would love it if to transition to more of the Q&A, if you could read that part of your book that is one of the larger takeaways. If you could. I
know we were talking a little bit about this beforehand, and there is this excerpt I would like to read, and hopefully, I mean, I won't say too much about it except set it up because I think it speaks for itself. But it comes at the end of the investigation after the men have arrested. Obviously, most people will know the bombs did not go off, because if they had, everyone would know, because it was described by the federal judge who sentenced the men that it would have been worse than the Oklahoma City bombing in terms of casualties and destruction. So yeah, we would all know about it, but the bombs did not go off, and that's a good thing. So this is a scene. They've arrested the men, and FBI agent, one of the FBI agents, or the two FBI agents, are with Patrick Stein, who's the most vocal and hate-filled of all of them. They're in a county jail in an interrogation room, and let me just find the pages here. And so they've, again, Stein has been arrested, and they, the FBI agents know they've got these guys. They've got the tapes. The guys have, convicted themselves with their own tapes. But Robin Smith and Amy Kuhn are the two FBI agents. Robin still, they do one of this debriefing or interrogation of Patrick Stein. And what's kind of driving Robin a little bit batty is like, all right, we know he did it, and we know we're going to be able to convict him. But he wanted to poke at Stein about the why of this. Okay. And I ended up using this as a way to sort of end the main narrative action, the main narrative of the book, except for the epilogue, because to me, it becomes, you have this face-off between basically Robin Smith and the terrorist Patrick Stein that becomes, I think, emblematic of America, where we are today in terms of the Great Divide. And I'll just let now, start it and let the anecdote, let the scene speak for itself. So they're in the interview room. Agent Smith got things started. "Why are we here?" he asked Patrick. "Because I'm a patriot, bro. I love my country. I love the people in it." "I'm listening," the agent said. "I'm a Christian, and I don't like it when people want to kill my people." "I'm listening," the agent said. "That's all they want to do," Stein said about the Muslims. "They being?" the agent asked. "The cockroaches." Patrick let the word hang in the air, then asked for some more coffee. Agent Kuhn took a turn. "You said you're a patriot," she said. "Yeah," Patrick said. "You're not a criminal?" "No." "Well, explain that to me." Patrick said, "We have enemies within our borders that are sworn to kill every one of us." "Who are these enemies?" Kuhn asked. Patrick grew annoyed. "You know who they are," he said. "Don't," and Kuhn interrupted. "I'm not patronizing you." The interview had morphed into a quasi-debate. The contestants arguing about the meaning of patriotism across a table that was as wide as the Grand Canyon in terms of irreconcilable differences. The agents and the terrorists shared the same physical space, an interview room in the county sheriff's department, but not the same concept of America. "I'm a patriot," Patrick kept insisting, "ready to do everything I can to save this nation from going over the cliff." He continually challenged the agents. He said mockingly, "Do you know anything about Muslims? Have you done any kind of research on them? Do you know? I mean, come on, dude. I would think you, of all people, you and anybody else in the FBI, would be more knowledgeable and have more information and know way more than me, just Joe Blow, stupid farmer, about Muslims or Islam. Muslims despised and killed Christians," he declared, "and we invite them to the country?" Patrick looked disgusted. "They're not productive goddamn people." Agent Kuhn said, "You don't believe there's any productive Muslims in this country?" "Tell me what they're doing that's productive." "There's some that are in the military fighting for the United States." Patrick dismissed that fact, calling any Muslim in the US military a spy, feeding intel to the enemy. He then taunted her and Smith for arresting him, Curtis Allen, and Gavin Wright. "You're taking down the very goddamn people who are willing to give their life to save yours. Do you not get that? The FBI agents were the traitors," he said. "You don't give a goddamn about your country." Enough was enough, and Agent Smith pushed back hard. His words weren't the final ones in the meandering session, as the parties talked in circles and past one another, never coming close to common ground. But the rebuttal might as well have been the last word, because Smith seemed to be speaking not only for himself, but for most Americans. You know, the veteran agent said, the amazing thing about the United States of America and the Constitution that we live under is you're entitled to that opinion. He let that sink in before repeating it. No matter how appalling Patrick's views, Agent Smith would not try to deprive him of the right to that opinion. And, Smith added, he would not deprive him of the right to participate in the country's political process. But more important, Smith said, he would not interfere with Patrick's right to life, which is exactly what Patrick and his partners had plotted to do against Muslims living in Garden City, Kansas. Agent Smith said, I won't kill you because you believe differently than me. Debate done. And on Monday, the next Monday, October 17th, the three Crusaders accused of domestic terrorism were arraigned in federal court in the case officially called the United States of America versus Curtis Wayne Allen, Patrick Eugene Stein, and Gavin Wayne Wright. So I just thought that was an amazing thing. Again, on the tape. It was in the tapes. If you didn't have the tapes, and I got to interview Smith about, what was it like? I don't they would never remember or be able to recreate a moment like that. But I just thought I just thought that was so fundamental.
It is. And I wonder do you think that, this seems like a unique book in many ways, even though it does have the elements that you looked at before with the FBI and informants. But this is a standout book, different in some ways. What are your takeaways from it? You're a journalist and a teacher. You're training journalists. What are your big takeaways, and how do you see the United States now?
Well, I think as far as the book and the story goes, the takeaways, I mean, this is tough stuff, which I don't think it's like holding up a mirror maybe in a bit. It's tough stuff. And I don't think we should be shying away from the depth of domestic terrorism and the hate that is in America, and it's feeding on itself. And I think a story like this, because of again, storytelling resources, helps define that issue, dramatizes that issue. I don't know what the solutions are, but the first step is defining it, helping to define it. I think hopefully in a memorable, riveting way. So it's not just words, but this is real. This is what they really say. This is what they really do. And as there were very many uncomfortable moments in the research and reporting and reading and listening to the tapes, which is how I stumbled into the title in a way, because there was always a working title, Garden City Bomb Plot. But I think it was after listening to Patrick Stein in one of his racist rants when I kind of just stopped, in a jaw-dropping kind of thing, and just going, wow, the hate is so white hot. And then I said, that's it. It's white hot hate. And that's how I came to the title. But I think what it was at the end of the day, kind of what's big for me, or the takeaway for this, is that this is a story that tracks. Yes, it's about hate, this white hot hate that's, I think, consuming America. Unfortunately, it's a big challenge of ours. But what I like about this is that it's also about justice, and justice in the form of Dan Day, an ordinary guy who does an extraordinary thing and is, in my mind, the ultimate patriot, working as an informant. And then there is this, so hate and justice. And then I think finally some hope, because the bombs did not go off in this instance. And this community, when news broke that these men were arrested because they were planning to blow them to smithereens, there was great fear in the Somali community. And it was almost as if the bombs might have gone off because they all wanted to run to somewhere else. In a weird way, the terrorists would have achieved their goal, get rid of the Somalis from Carson City, one way or the other. But instead, the community rallied, and there were public events and signs, and I won't call them demonstrations because it was supportive stuff. Making the Somalis and the police, the city officials were part of it, saying, no, you're welcome here. That these guys aren't us. These guys, unfortunately, are part of what's going on in America today, but they are not us, and we want you here and we want you to stay. And most of them did. And so there's a sense of hope at the end. I think that we all have to hold on to, if whether it's this event or just, events that are tearing us apart in so many different ways.
One other question from the audience is, what, if any, response or feedback did you receive from the Somali American community?
I mean, when the book came out, I have made established relationship with a handful, and they're happy with it because, and it's just was, and I was glad to hear that, because I was determined to not have Somalis just appear in the book as the targets and stick characters, and I spent I wanted to take the time to bring to life a handful of key Somali characters. I couldn't write about the entire community, individually, but I needed to identify a handful of Somalis who could be, developed characters in the story for a variety of reasons. And I did do that. And I needed help with that because I needed a translator. And so it took some time to, connect my way into the community. And once having done that, to identify people who I wanted to go even further with, because I want you to be somebody in the story. And so they appreciated that they, they just weren't, a list of, or a name, just a label, that they were people and characters in the story.
Right. It wasn't just sort of a fill in the blank. This was a story about a community, about people who had markets, who were in schools, who were, trying to sell whatever that was in their store or try to get an education. They were working hard. They were in one of the most difficult and dangerous jobs in the United States is in the meat packing industry.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's certainly something to be said. And I really learned that. And I appreciate how you created these full-bodied people who really, in all of them, could be cardboard cutouts because they have been presented that way, but not in your book.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's the word, the phrase I was looking for. I didn't want cardboard cutouts.
Well, mission accomplished. I think you did it. And I want to thank you so much. And I would hold your book up again, and with my little sticky notes here, because I had so much I needed to think about and revisit. I appreciate your work, your contribution, and for telling us something that we didn't know and we learned so much from. We appreciate your expertise and your willingness to share that story with us. And we're looking forward to the next one.
Okay. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.